Well, hello and welcome to another Kings at Home Daily. My name's Golf, one of the leaders here at Kings, and it's my privilege to take us through the next few verses in our studies in the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles. We've been looking at the story of Stephen. He was to become the first Christian martyr, and he's been accused of speaking against Moses, blaspheming against Moses and against the temple and so on and so forth. And he's now making his defense to his accusers. So we're in chapter 7 and starting at verse 17. He's basically been giving his accusers a Bible study and going through the history of God's people. And we pick up in the middle of the story, verse 17. As the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. And then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. And he dealt treacherously with our people, oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so they would die. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. Other translations say he was fair in the sight of God. There was something about him that was special. For 3 months he was cared for by his family, and when he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him in and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites, and he saw one of them being ill-treated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. Hint, hint, making his accusers aware that they're in danger of missing out what God's doing. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you're my brothers, why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was ill-treating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you'd killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. And when he saw this, he was amazed at the sight, and he went over to get a closer look. He heard the Lord saying, "I am the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Moses trembled with fear and dared not look. And the Lord said to him, "Take off your sandals. The place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I've heard their groanings, and I've come down to set them free. Now, come, I will send you back to Egypt." This is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, "Who made you a ruler and judge?" He was sent to be their ruler and redeemer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt, and he performed wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and for 40 years in the wilderness. This is the Moses who told the Israelites, "God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people." He was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us. But our ancestors refused to obey him. They rejected him and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. Hint, hint, you're doing the same thing. You're rejecting what God is doing. And they told Aaron, "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him." That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it, revelled in what their own hands had made. But God turned away from them and gave them over to the worship of the sun, the moon and the stars. This agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets. And then he quotes from Amos chapter 5. I find that passage quite a scary passage. Some very encouraging things. It's also quite scary. These dear people who They thought they thought they knew God. They thought they understood the scriptures. They thought they were defenders of the scriptures. But in fact, they'd got stuck in their ways. They weren't alert to what God was doing and saying, and they ended up. It's these scary words. God turned away from them. That's scary, isn't it? That people of great privilege, God's people in the Old Testament, people of Israel, God turned away from them. God forbid that we should ever be privileged people, privileged to hear the good news of the gospel and end up turning away, following after things that we make with our own hands, things of material things that we think are more important. But anyway, back to the story. As I said at the beginning, Stephen is trying to give these dear folks a Bible study. He's trying to show them how all of the scriptures point to Jesus. It reminds me of the men on the road to Emmaus. Do you remember? They thought Jesus had his body had disappeared. That they were obviously sympathetic disciples, and they'd heard that Jesus' body had disappeared, and they were sort of flummoxed and discouraged. And then Jesus came and walked with them. They didn't recognise him, and he opened their eyes to see how all the scriptures point to him. It says their hearts burned within them. It's lovely, isn't it? I mean, that's what the Holy Spirit does when we allow him. These are words of life. So whenever you open the Bible, make sure you do that. Holy Spirit, come and make things alive to me. Lord, may the entrance of your word bring light. Holy Spirit, I want my heart to burn. So we should do that when we open the scriptures. And Stephen is telling him how Moses really, far from sort of blaspheming Moses, Stephen is saying Moses was pointing to Jesus. And you can see the parallel as I read it out. There's that beautiful verse in verse 33 at the burning bush where God says, take off your sandals. And then God says this, I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I've heard their groaning and I've come down to set them free. That's the gospel. The God of the burning bush, awesome. God of creation, God of all power, the holy God. He's seen the oppression of ordinary people. And then it gets even better. I've heard their groaning. How often have you thought, God's not hearing me? Maybe your heart is heavy, or maybe the things that you're troubled about. I've heard their groaning. What does it say next? And I've come down to set them free. There's the gospel. God has heard you, and for the sake of your groaning, your troubles, your difficulties, he has come down in the person of Jesus. And he's walked the walk that we walk. He knows the challenges that we feel. And he's been to the cross to take on himself all the punishment that we ever deserved so that we could have a hope and a future. It's a beautiful verse. And this is Moses. And Stephen makes the connection again in the next verse. It says that in verse 35, this is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, who made you a ruler and judge? He was sent to be their ruler and redeemer by God himself. There it is again. So it's pointing to Jesus. Moses was sent to be their ruler and redeemer. How much more was Jesus sent to be our ruler, our king and our redeemer? We redeem something by paying a price, don't you? You redeem something back. I don't know if people use pawn shops anymore. You redeem it. You pay the price to get it back. That's what Jesus did on the cross. So it's beautiful. These dear men are being presented with the gospel, but they're not hearing it. And then he points at it again in verse 38, speaking of Moses and as God's representative. He was in the assembly in the wilderness. Now that's a really interesting word there, assembly. It's the same word as has been used for the gatherings of Christians in chapter 5. It's the word church. And so he's making the direct connection that actually the gathering of God's people now, the church is the gathering of God's people. And he's not to be confined to the temple, but he's in the gathering, the gathered together, the church. So wonderful parallels here we see of redemption history. That's what we call it, the history of redemption. The glimpses that the Old Testament contains that point through to what Jesus would do on the cross. So it's a beautiful passage, and it inspires me. It reminds me of the privilege that we have living at a time we live, the fulfillment of the ages. We're the inheritors of promises. It should radically change our lives when we realise the huge privilege that is ours. Let us not be guilty of what the accusers of Stephen were guilty of. They got stuck in their ways, couldn't see what the Lord was doing. God, give us eyes to see what he's doing in our day, to make sure that we're part of what he's doing, recognising that we're hugely privileged as the people of God, living for his time when he will come again to make all things new. Well, I think I've used up my time. God bless you. Have a great day, and may the Lord go with you wherever you're going. God bless.